April 7th, 1943. The black waters of the Solomon Sea reflected the faint light of a half-shrouded moon. The night was restless, the jungle alive with the rasp of cicadas, the shuffle of unseen creatures, and the distant rumble of surf against coral. On New Georgia Island, Japanese sentries peered across a coastline of mangroves and shadow, their eyes straining for the silhouettes of American landing craft. To their ears, the forest seemed to whisper betrayal, but nothing prepared them for what dawn would reveal. At first light, mist hung low over the coconut palms, drifting like smoke from phantom fires. Japanese scouts crept forward to survey the beaches they believed too rough, too wild, too inhospitable for any serious American advance. What they found made their breath catch in disbelief. Where only swamp and scrub jungle had stood the night before, an airstrip stretched like a scar across the island's heart, flat, smooth, wide enough for warplanes. It was impossible. It should have taken months. Yet American bombers and fighters were already wheeling overhead, their shadows slicing across the jungle floor. The Japanese had built airfields themselves, but always at terrible cost. Thousands of laborers with picks and baskets, months of sweat under the tropical sun, endless nights of malarial fevers. To see one appear overnight was to confront sorcery, a miracle of speed and engineering that defied every principle they had known. In their field reports, officers described the sight in disbelief. The enemy constructs with the hand of the gods. For the Americans, this was no miracle. It was the work of the naval construction battalions, the Seabees. They had landed silently in the dead of night with bulldozers, graders, and trucks lashed to barges. Men in dungarees, steel helmets cocked low, engines roaring before the first shot was fired. They swarmed ashore like an army of ants, clearing jungle by fire and steel, crushing coral into runways, laying steel matting with hands blistered and bleeding. Where the Japanese expected to find mud and mangroves, the Seabees carved open-air gateways for American air power. Imagine the perspective of a Japanese forward observer, binoculars raised, sweat stinging his eyes. He had been trained to measure progress in weeks, not hours. To him, construction was slow, agonizing, a crawl of timber and stone. But here machines roared through the night with a tempo that matched artillery barrages. Diesel smoke mingled with the smell of salt and rot, filling the jungle canopy like a storm cloud. Every crash of falling palm trees echoed like the thunder of guns. By sunrise, an entire landscape had been reshaped. Reports filtered back to Japanese headquarters. Commanders dismissed them as exaggerations until reconnaissance flights confirmed the impossible truth. Photographs revealed runways gleaming in the sun, aircraft already stationed in neat rows, fuel dumps and supply depots rising like mirages. Panic rippled through the command structure. They had underestimated not only the will of the Americans, but their astonishing ability to bend terrain itself into a weapon. The Japanese soldiers stationed near these islands told stories that bordered on legend. They spoke of ghost engineers who worked without rest, who dragged whole jungles into the sea and flattened mountains in a single night. Soldiers whispered that even the earth itself conspired with the Americans, that the gods had granted them machines capable of conjuring airfields from nothing. Morale faltered not just because of the airstrips, but because of the speed, the terrifying speed of their creation. On Rendova, on Bougainville, on Guadalcanal, the pattern repeated. American landings no longer meant months of attrition before air cover could be established. Within hours of hitting the beaches, fighters took to the skies. Within days, bombers rumbled off new runways to strike Japanese supply lines. The rhythm of war was accelerating, and the Seabees were its drummers, pounding out a tempo the enemy could not match. Witness accounts described the disorientation of Japanese infantry as American planes, seemingly birthed from the jungle itself, screamed overhead. One veteran recalled crouching in his foxhole, staring in disbelief at a P-38 Lightning banking, low above a runway that had not existed when he had closed his eyes the previous evening. The sensation was not just one of defeat, but of helpless awe. They were fighting men who could alter reality overnight. The island campaigns of the Pacific were defined by geography: coral atolls, volcanic ridges, dense jungles. To control the air was to control the islands, and the Americans, through the Seabees, had discovered a way to seize the skies almost instantly. Their construction units became as decisive as any battleship or carrier. For every bombing raid that crippled Japanese positions, there was a team of Seabees who had carved out the runway beneath the wheels of those planes. For every amphibious landing that succeeded, there was a path behind it flattened and paved by sweating engineers who worked under fire. The Japanese could not comprehend how these runways materialized. They had intelligence reports about American factories, about shipyards and aircraft plants, but little understanding of how such resources could be projected into the wilderness. The Seabees were invisible in enemy calculations, yet they were rewriting the rules of warfare. To the Japanese, who struggled to build and defend static outposts, the Americans seemed to fight with a new kind of weapon, speed itself. Every time an airstrip appeared overnight, it sent ripples of fear through the jungle. Japanese commanders shifted troops in desperation, reinforcing strongpoints already doomed by the presence of American air power. Soldiers at the front whispered of sorcery, while generals at headquarters faced the cold arithmetic. Without control of the skies, no garrison could hold. The shock of American engineering prowess was as devastating as any bombardment. Thus, in those humid nights of 1943, as the jungles of the Pacific burned under the Seabees' blades and torches, a new kind of warfare was born. The clash was not only of rifles and bayonets, but of will against ingenuity, of time against machinery. Where the Japanese thought the terrain itself their greatest ally, the Americans transformed it into their stage. The jungle, the coral, the mud all yielded to steel, diesel and determination, and so, as the sun rose over New Georgia, Guadalcanal, and countless unnamed islands, Japanese soldiers stood stunned, staring at runways that should not exist, at fighters already lifting into the dawn sky. What they saw was not just an airstrip, it was the future, a future in which the tempo of war belonged to those who could build as quickly as they could fight. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had shifted into a brutal stalemate. The Japanese Empire, flush with early victories across Asia and the Pacific, stretched its dominion across thousands of miles of ocean, its garrisons entrenched in coral fortresses and jungle strongholds. The rising sun flew over island chains once thought untouchable. From Rabaul to Truk, from Wake to Guadalcanal, they had forged a defensive ring meant to bleed any invader white. But beneath the surface of their triumph, cracks had begun to spread. Logistics strained under the enormity of distance. Supply ships vanished beneath the waves, hunted by submarines that prowled like wolves. Airfields on far-flung islands grew increasingly vital, their runways the lifelines of the empire. Whoever commanded the skies commanded the seas, and whoever commanded the seas dictated the fate of the islands. For the Americans, the war was as much a battle against geography as it was against the enemy. The Pacific was an ocean of distances so vast, they seemed to mock the very idea of invasion. Every mile forward required a leap across water, a foothold on some speck of coral or volcanic ash, and the transformation of hostile wilderness into a fortress. It was a war of engineering as much as firepower. And in that war the Seabees were the unseen army. By the time American troops clashed with Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands, the contrast in doctrine between the two empires had already taken shape. Japanese commanders placed their faith in defense in depth, in infantry dug into caves, ridges, and bunkers, supplied from secure airfields painstakingly constructed over months. Their doctrine assumed that building, like fighting, was slow and grueling. The very terrain was considered an ally, its swamps and jungles serving as natural barriers. The Americans saw it differently. Guided by the lessons of amphibious warfare, and supported by an industrial base unmatched in human history, they conceived of speed as a weapon in itself. To seize an island was not enough. It had to be transformed into a forward base almost instantly, before Japanese reinforcements could strike back. If that transformation could be achieved in days instead of months, then the enemy's entire strategy unraveled. This was the broader situation in 1943, when the strange reports began to unsettle Japanese intelligence. In the aftermath of the battles of Guadalcanal, they noted a new phenomenon. Wherever the Americans landed, airfields sprang up with shocking speed. A beach that had been jungle at dusk became a runway by dawn. Japanese scouts described bulldozers tearing through the night like armored beasts, torchlight glinting off blades as engines roared against the silence of the jungle. The confusion in Japanese ranks was not just about the machinery, but about the doctrine behind it. Their soldiers were accustomed to sweat, picks and shovels, the slow, crushing work of labor battalions who carved runways by hand. They could not fathom a force that arrived with its own mechanical arsenal, an engineering corps that landed alongside the infantry. It was as though the Americans had blurred the line between soldier and builder, creating a hybrid warrior who wielded both rifle and bulldozer. At the strategic level, the implications were staggering. American planners now had a weapon that made geography malleable. Islands no longer had to be seized and held until naval forces could drag forward the lumbering apparatus of construction. With Seabees in tow, every landing force carried within it the seed of an instant airbase. This shifted the rhythm of the war itself. What the Japanese assumed would be a campaign of months could unfold in weeks. Commanders in Tokyo realized too late that the Americans were fighting a new kind of war. Their own war machine was built around meticulous planning, around supply chains that could support slow but steady fortification. They had envisioned the Pacific as a chessboard, each island a piece to be captured and defended at great cost. The Americans, by contrast, treated it as a racetrack, each island a lap to be rounded as quickly as possible, each runway a springboard for the next leap forward. And so, as 1943 unfolded, the contest became not only one of soldiers clashing in foxholes, but of construction battalions racing against time. When the Marines hit the beaches of Rendover or Bougainville, the Seabees landed right behind them, bulldozers nosing through surf, graders clanking down ramps, trucks spewing exhaust into the humid air. While Japanese defenders fired from ridges and tree lines, the Seabees were already shaping the battlefield of tomorrow. The historical context of this struggle reveals why Japanese soldiers were so stunned. Their doctrine had never prepared them for an enemy who could conjure infrastructure overnight. They had trained to face bombardment, infantry assaults, armored thrusts, but not this. Not an adversary who fought the jungle itself as if it were just another enemy to be subdued. For the Americans, every new runway shortened the war. Every airstrip meant bombers could leapfrog closer to Japan's inner defenses, fighters could shield invasions, and supply lines could be tightened. To Japanese eyes, it seemed as if the Americans had found a way to erase distance itself. Thus, by the middle years of the war, the Pacific had become more than a clash of fleets and armies. It was a test of who could master the environment. On one side, Japanese doctrine sought to hold ground, to build slowly and defend stubbornly. On the other, the Americans wielded speed, machinery and improvisation, turning each captured island into a launch pad before the enemy had time to react. This was the stage upon which the Seabees would write their legend. Against a backdrop of jungle storms, coral reefs and volcanic rock, they would alter the very tempo of the conflict. And for Japanese soldiers staring in disbelief at runways that should not exist, it was a lesson that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The realization that the Americans were not merely fighting battles. They were rewriting the laws of war itself. On the night of June 30th, 1943, the first waves of American Marines waded ashore at Rendover, an island draped in jungle and lashed by rain. The Japanese defenders braced for another slow grind, weeks of mud, malaria, and attrition before the invaders could bring their full strength to bear. They expected the pattern they themselves had endured, months of back-breaking labor before an airfield could take shape. But as the battle smoke drifted inland and the thunder of naval guns faded, a different kind of thunder rose from the beaches, the growl of diesel engines. The Seabees had arrived. Hidden within the convoys that carried Marines and supplies were machines the Japanese never anticipated. Bulldozers wrapped in tarps, tractors chained to decks, steel matting stacked like slabs of armor. As Japanese mortars began to fall, men in blue dungarees rolled these machines into the surf, pushing through the chaos with an urgency that startled even the Marines. By the time the first defensive skirmishes erupted on the island's ridges, the Seabees were already cutting a swath through the jungle. This was the hidden advantage the Japanese could not comprehend, the ability to build faster than the enemy could destroy. While infantry fought and bled for footholds, the Seabees transformed those footholds into forward bases with breathtaking speed. They carried in their hands not only rifles, but spades and wrenches. They were construction men armed for war, equally capable of returning fire and laying down steel matting for aircraft. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was more than a slogan. It was a doctrine that shifted the very rhythm of the Pacific Campaign. The secret was not just manpower, but machinery and organization. The Americans had deployed entire battalions whose sole purpose was to bend hostile terrain into submission. The Japanese had laborers, often conscripted or coerced, digging with picks under the lash of officers. The Americans had caterpillar bulldozers, whose roaring engines could level a grove of palms in minutes. The Japanese had hand-cut gravel and wheelbarrows. The Americans had steel-plated mast and matting, sheets that could be locked together to form runways in days, impervious to mud and rain. The difference was as stark as night and day. Japanese engineers, brave and resourceful as they were, measured progress in weeks of sweat. The Americans measured it in hours of fuel. A Japanese report from Bougainville later noted, with a tone of near disbelief, that the enemy possesses mechanical devices of construction which permit them to finish works in a fraction of the time. It was not just equipment, but doctrine. American commanders understood that every hour counted in the Pacific. If planes could fly from an island within days of its capture, then Japanese counterattacks, whether by sea or by air, would be blunted before they began. The Seabees gave them that edge, conjuring airfields where the enemy expected mud. This advantage was hidden not in secrecy, but in speed. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, it was already too late. Consider Guadalcanal, where the battle for Henderson Field raged through late 1942. The Japanese had invested enormous effort in constructing their airstrip, sweating under disease and bombardment for months. The Americans, once they seized it, expanded and reinforced it with a rapidity that shocked the defenders. Within weeks, Henderson was a fortress of steel and coral, its runways humming with aircraft that ruled the skies. What had taken the Japanese months of toil, the Americans consolidated in mere days with the help of their construction battalions. By 1943, the Japanese began to grasp that this was not coincidence. It was a deliberate weapon. The hidden advantage of the Americans was not a single machine or tactic, but the entire concept of mobile, militarized construction. While Japanese infantry dug foxholes and fortified caves, the Seabees fought a different battle, against the terrain itself. They cleared jungles with fire and dynamite, carved roads across swamps, blasted harbors into reefs and raised fuel depots out of mangrove muck. Their enemy was mud, rain, coral, and distance, and in defeating that enemy, they defeated the Japanese as well. To the men in the field, the sight was surreal. A Japanese soldier might fall asleep in a foxhole, hearing only the thrum of crickets and the drip of rain. By dawn, he would awaken to the sound of engines and see an airstrip stretching across ground that had been jungle hours before. Fighters clawed skyward, their engines howling, as though the earth itself had given birth to them overnight. This was the hidden edge. The Americans had learned to weaponize time itself. The Japanese were unnerved because they could not counter it. Bombardments could crater runways, but the Seabees filled the holes within hours. Air raids could torch supplies, but new depots rose just as quickly. It seemed no matter how many shells or bombs were spent, the Americans rebuilt faster than destruction could keep pace. "They are like ants," one Japanese private wrote in his diary. "No matter how many we crush, more come and they build again." The hidden advantage extended beyond airstrips. On every island, roads sprang up where none had existed. Fuel lines snaked across beaches, barracks, and hospitals rose in days. What had once been uninhabitable wilderness became a military city almost overnight. The Seabees gave the Americans not just mobility, but permanence. They ensured that every island captured became an unshakable fortress, an iron stepping stone toward Japan. This was the revelation that chilled Japanese officers. The Americans were not just fighters. They were builders. Every Marine rifleman was backed by a construction army that could transform the battlefield in a matter of hours. Every invasion force carried within it the seed of an airfield, a port, a base. The Japanese could no longer rely on time, terrain, or distance to slow their enemy, and so the shock spread from foxholes to headquarters, from the whispers of soldiers to the pages of intelligence reports. The Americans had unveiled a new kind of warfare, one in which engineers fought alongside infantry, in which bulldozers landed with tanks, and in which victory was measured not only in ground taken, but in runways laid. The hidden advantage was revealed at last: the Seabees, and the astonishing speed with which they could build war from nothing. The first time a bulldozer's roar echoed across the Pacific battlefield, Japanese officers thought it was a tank. The machine's engine bellowed like an armored beast, its steel blade cutting through jungle with a force that dwarfed any shell. But it was not built for destruction, it was built for creation. And in that paradox lay one of America's greatest hidden weapons of World War II. The engineering heart of the Seabees was forged in factories thousands of miles from the front. In Peoria, Illinois, the Caterpillar Company churned out bulldozers, D7s and D8s, that became as vital to the Pacific campaign as Sherman tanks were in Europe. The Caterpillar D7, weighing nearly 28,000 pounds, carried a diesel engine capable of delivering 80 horsepower to a steel blade that could rip through coral, clay and tree roots with relentless precision. Its larger cousin, the D8, tipped the scales at 35,000 pounds, its 148 horsepower engine driving a blade wide enough to push an entire grove of palms into the sea. These machines were no longer construction tools, they were instruments of war. To the Japanese, who relied on human laborers wielding picks and shovels, these machines seemed almost alive. A single bulldozer could accomplish in one night what would take hundreds of men weeks to achieve. Palm trees toppled like matchsticks, their trunks shoved aside in heaps. Coral ridges were ground flat into powder. Swamps were filled with earth and rock, drained by ditches carved in mannits. The jungle itself bowed before these iron leviathans, yet the machines were only part of the miracle. The Seabees brought with them mast and matting, technically called pierced steel planking, PSP. Each sheet measured 10 feet long, 15 inches wide, and was punched with holes to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. Soldiers locked them together like puzzle pieces, forming instant runways that could handle the weight of bombers and fighters. In the muddy, rain-soaked tropics, where traditional construction would have bogged down for months, PSP turned swamps into airfields overnight. A C-47 transport, a P-38 Lightning, even a lumbering B-25 bomber could roll out on a strip of metal laid by exhausted hands in a single night. The Japanese had no such system. Their airstrips required crushed coral, gravel, and timber, materials that had to be gathered, hauled, and compacted by endless lines of laborers. In the time it took the Japanese to finish a single runway, the Americans could construct a dozen. Reports from Japanese reconnaissance flights described their shock. Where yesterday there was jungle, today there is iron ground glistening in the sun. The Seabees carried not just bulldozers and matting, but entire mobile factories. Welding shops, generators, sawmills, and pumps came ashore with them. In a matter of days, they could fabricate bridges, fuel tanks, and piers. They built water purification systems, medical stations, and communications towers, all under enemy fire. Their toolkits were as essential as rifles, their blueprints as deadly as battle plans. Consider the SCR-270 radar towers that rose from Pacific Islands. While Marines fought for the beaches, Seabees erected the scaffolding, threading wires through the jungle until great dishes turned skyward. These radar systems gave American commanders advance warning of Japanese raids, tipping the balance in the skies. Once again, the Seabees' technical genius magnified the combat power of every soldier, sailor, and pilot who followed them. Even fuel became a weapon. The Seabees laid down thousands of miles of pipeline across the Pacific, pumping gasoline and aviation fuel to newly built depots. In the Solomon Islands alone, they constructed over 80 million gallons of storage capacity, an ocean of fuel that kept the American war machine moving forward. Japanese commanders could scarcely believe the scale. To them, it was as though the Americans carried entire cities in their hulls and unpacked them onto beaches overnight. Behind every technical marvel stood the factories of America's industrial heartland. From Detroit came the trucks, jeeps, and graders that gave the Seabees their mobility. From Pittsburgh came the steel that became matting and pipes. From California came prefabricated huts, shipped in pieces and reassembled in the field. This synergy, factories feeding builders who fed the war effort, was something the Japanese could not match. Their industry strained just to replace losses. The Americans seemed to have an endless flood of machines and materials, but numbers alone did not explain the difference. Doctrine did. The United States Navy had envisioned construction as a combat mission, not a logistical afterthought. Each naval construction battalion was armed, trained, and organized to fight under fire. Their equipment was designed to be landed from Higgins boats and pontoons, driven directly through surf onto hostile beaches. They operated as shock troops of engineering, their bulldozers as vital as rifles, their matting as crucial as artillery. The Japanese, by contrast, treated construction as a slow rear area function, often relegated to underfed labor units with no protection and little machinery. When their airstrips were bombed, repairs dragged on for weeks. When American airstrips were bombed, Seabees filled the craters before the smoke cleared. The contrast was devastating. And so the technical details, horsepower ratings, dimensions of steel matting, gallons of fuel storage, were not dry statistics. They were the bones of a revolution. Each number represented speed, resilience, and the ability to outpace an enemy locked in the past. The Japanese fought bravely, their soldiers disciplined and their pilots deadly, but they were tethered to a doctrine of slowness. The Americans, through the Seabees, had made speed into their sharpest blade. Imagine a Japanese pilot circling Bougainville, staring down at a runway that had not existed days before. He saw fighters scrambling to meet him, their wheels kicking dust off PSP that gleamed in the sun. He saw trucks racing across new roads, bulldozers pushing earth, cranes lifting supplies. What he saw was not just an airfield. It was the embodiment of America's industrial and technical power, projected into the heart of the Pacific with terrifying immediacy. The machines, the steel, the fuel, the doctrine, all combined into a hidden advantage that Japanese soldiers could neither match nor stop. This was the technical deep dive of the Seabees miracle, an army of builders, equipped with the might of American industry, transforming islands into fortresses with a speed that seemed to bend time itself. September 13, 1944. The humid air over Bougainville shimmered with heat as dawn broke. Japanese scouts, weary from weeks of skirmishing, scanned the jungle edge where the Americans had landed. They expected to see Marines digging in, tents rising, the slow crawl of logistics turning beaches into camps. Instead, they saw something that defied logic. Aircraft already circling overhead, their engines a low growl that promised devastation. In a matter of days, the Seabees had built an airfield from the very bones of the island, and the first sorties were taking off before Japanese artillery could even range the beach. The Battle of Bougainville became a showcase of the Seabees' speed. Within 14 days of the initial landings at Cape Torokina, the 71st Naval Construction Battalion had completed a functional fighter strip, hacked out of jungle and swamp under relentless fire. Bulldozers pushed through mud that swallowed trucks whole. Dynamite cleared mangrove roots thicker than men's waists, and steel matting locked into place under hands, blistered and bleeding. Japanese snipers fired from treetops, artillery shells churned the earth, yet the work never stopped. At night, torches flared like a constellation across the clearing, as Seabees labored by firelight, their silhouettes cast against the rising skeleton of a runway. When the first F-4U Corsairs roared into the sky, the Japanese could scarcely believe it. They had assumed the swampy terrain would delay American air operations for months. Instead, fighters were strafing their positions within weeks and bombers soon followed. The Japanese 17th Army, entrenched in the jungles and mountains of Bougainville, suddenly found themselves under constant air attack. Their supply lines withered under the weight of American air power, and their morale began to crack. The battle reports paint a vivid picture. On November 8th, just 1 month after the landings, American bombers from the new strip struck Rabaul, Japan's great stronghold in the South Pacific. The blow was devastating. The airfield at Cape Torokina had transformed the strategic map overnight. What the Japanese had believed a distant threat had become a dagger at their throat. Their commanders called it unthinkable, that such a swamp could be converted into a fortress of air in so short a time. Bougainville was not the only example. The story repeated across the Pacific. At Rendova, Seabees built an airfield in less than 2 weeks under a curtain of rain and mortar fire, enabling American planes to dominate New Georgia. At Espiritu Santo, they carved a bomber strip so vast it could launch B-24 Liberators to strike deep into enemy territory. At Tinian, the Seabees' crowning achievement, They constructed the largest airfield of the Pacific War, North Field, capable of hosting hundreds of B-29 superfortresses. It was from Tinian that the Enola Gay would later rise into the morning sky, carrying a weapon that would end the war. The statistics stagger the imagination. On Guam alone, Seabees laid down nearly 10 million square feet of airstrips in a matter of weeks. On Iwo Jima, amid volcanic ash and ceaseless Japanese fire, they turned a blasted landscape into a forward emergency landing base that saved thousands of American airmen. At Okinawa, the construction effort rivaled a city rising overnight. Runways, harbors, depots, and hospitals sprawling across the island, even as shells rained down. For the Japanese, these feats were incomprehensible. Their doctrine had not prepared them for an enemy that could turn raw jungle into a fortress with such speed. Diaries of captured soldiers describe their shock. The enemy makes land as if from the sea. In the morning there is swamp. In the evening there is iron ground. To them it was sorcery. To the Americans, it was the relentless application of industrial power. The impact on the battlefield was immediate. Japanese counterattacks often came too late. At Bougainville, reinforcements landed in force, only to be shredded by American aircraft flying from the brand-new airfield. At Tinian, Japanese artillery pounded the beaches, but American bombers were already airborne, striking supply depots and convoys before the defenders could mount an organized resistance. The tempo of the war had shifted irrevocably. German generals on the other side of the world had remarked in frustration that American armies fought as though connected by invisible wires, radios, logistics, speed. The Japanese came to a similar realization. The Americans fought with bulldozers and steel, as though the very earth obeyed their command. Every time an airstrip appeared overnight, it broke not just defenses but spirits. Soldiers who had braced for months of struggle found themselves bombed, strafed, and cut off within days. The after-action reports of American units reflect this new confidence. Commanders no longer spoke of if an airfield could be established, but when. The question was measured in hours, not months. Marines and Army soldiers knew that once the Seabees arrived, air cover was inevitable. They fought with the assurance that help was coming, that the sky would soon belong to them. This psychological edge was as powerful as any weapon. At Bougainville, one Marine recalled watching the Seabees at work under fire. They were as fearless as anyone I ever saw. Shells falling, snipers firing, and those bulldozers just kept moving forward. It was like watching the island itself surrender to them. That was the essence of these battles. The Seabees did not just build, they conquered. Each runway was a battle won, each depot a victory secured. The Japanese saw it and despaired. The Americans saw it and pressed forward with renewed vigor. The war in the Pacific was no longer a grinding stalemate of attrition. It had become a war of speed, momentum, and transformation. And at the heart of that transformation stood the Seabees, their machines roaring louder than any battle cry. For the Japanese soldier crouched in a foxhole on Bougainville, the first rumble of American engines meant more than noise. It meant inevitability. He had been told that the jungle was his ally, that swamps and mangroves would delay the enemy for months, that the land itself would shield the rising sun. Yet within days, he watched American aircraft climb into the sky from runways that had not existed when he closed his eyes at night. The effect was devastating, not just strategically but psychologically. The jungle had betrayed him. Time had betrayed him. Even the earth seemed to bow to the Americans. The strategic impact of the Seabees' speed cannot be overstated. Each airfield shortened the war's timeline, compressing months of expected struggle into days of decisive momentum. Where Japanese commanders had planned counterattacks, they found themselves instead under constant bombardment. Where they had fortified caves and ridges, they discovered that airstrikes had already reduced them to rubble. The very foundation of Japanese strategy, delaying the Americans until their will collapsed, was shattered. The Seabees gave the Americans control of the skies before the defenders could even organize resistance. From Guadalcanal to Tinian, the pattern repeated. Japanese intelligence officers scribbled frantic reports about the enemy's impossible speed of construction. They could not understand how craters from bombardments were filled before the smoke cleared, how airstrips seemed to rise even under artillery fire. In truth, it was the doctrine of the Seabees, armed engineers who built and fought simultaneously. But to Japanese eyes it appeared supernatural. as if the Americans had bent time itself. The psychological toll spread through every rank of the imperial service. Army soldiers who had once seen themselves as unyielding defenders of the emperors, islands began to whisper of American magic. Diaries recovered after battles reveal an undercurrent of awe and despair. They build as we bleed. They conjure steel from the mud. We cannot match them. This creeping sense of futility gnawed at morale, weakening units before the first shots were even fired. The Americans, by contrast, drew strength from the Seabees' presence. Infantrymen who waded ashore through surf and gunfire knew that within days, air cover would thunder overhead. That knowledge gave them courage to press forward. "We always knew they'd get the job done," one Marine recalled. "The Seabees were our promise that no matter how bad it got, the sky would soon belong to us." The certainty of air power was a shield, a reassurance that turned the tide of countless battles. Strategically, the Seabees multiplied the effectiveness of every branch of the military. For the Navy, their airstrips extended the reach of aircraft beyond the decks of carriers, creating land-based fortresses that freed ships for the next push. For the Army, they transformed isolated islands into forward bases, hubs of logistics that kept divisions supplied across the endless Pacific. For the Air Corps, they created stepping stones that carried bombers ever closer to Japan's home islands. Without the Seabees, the island-hopping campaign would have slowed to a crawl. With them, it surged forward like a relentless tide. The Japanese tried to adapt, but their doctrine was rooted in delay and attrition. They poured men into bunkers and caves, hoping to bleed the Americans dry. Yet every airfield built overnight turned those strongholds into death traps. Bombers reduced fortifications before infantry even reached them. Artillery duels became one-sided when American planes spotted targets from above. The Seabees, without firing a shot, had tilted the balance of every engagement. The psychological contrast was stark. American soldiers saw bulldozers pushing forward under fire and believed in inevitability. Victory was only a matter of time. Japanese soldiers saw the same bulldozers and felt despair, convinced that nothing could stop an enemy who could build faster than they could destroy. In modern terms, the Americans had achieved information dominance, not through intelligence alone, but through certainty. Certainty that their bases would always rise, that their skies would always be filled with friendly planes, that their momentum could not be broken. The impact rippled beyond the battlefield. Japanese commanders found themselves increasingly isolated, their communications severed by constant air raids, launched from brand new runways. Units reported that they could not hold positions because resupply was impossible under American air control. Garrison after garrison became stranded, cut off from food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Starvation and disease did what bullets could not. All of it traced back to the Seabees' ability to deliver airfields before the Japanese could react. In the end, it was not just the destruction of Japanese forces, but the collapse of their belief in time as a weapon. They had counted on distance, on geography, on the slow grind of logistics to wear down the Americans. Instead, they watched helplessly as time itself became America's greatest ally. The jungle, the swamps, the coral reefs, all bent before machines and men who worked without rest. For the Americans, the psychological victory was just as real. Veterans spoke of the Seabees with reverence, calling them the miracle workers of the Pacific. Their presence turned fear into confidence, hesitation into resolve. Every airfield built under fire was a declaration. This island is ours, and from here we will strike the next. Thus, the strategic and psychological impact of the Seabees' work cannot be separated. They did not simply build runways, they built momentum. They did not merely raise depots. They raised morale. And in doing so, they transformed the Pacific War from a contest of attrition into a relentless advance. The Japanese could not believe what they were seeing because, in truth, they were witnessing something new in the history of warfare. The weaponization of speed and construction, wielded with precision and determination. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and the Pacific lay strewn with the wreckage of fleets and the bones of shattered garrisons, the legacy of the Seabees remained etched not just into the islands they transformed, but into the very fabric of modern warfare. The Japanese had built fortresses of stone and steel, garrisons intended to last for years, The Americans had built runways and bases in days, and through them they had conquered. The lesson was unmistakable. Speed was no longer a luxury in war, it was the decisive weapon. In Tokyo's war archives, captured Japanese reports spoke with grudging awe. Commanders described the Seabees' work as beyond expectation, a factor that no amount of bravery or sacrifice could overcome. One officer wrote bitterly that the Americans commanded not only the seas and skies, but the very ground itself, reshaping it to their will. For men trained to see terrain as immutable, this realization was shattering. The jungle, once trusted as a shield, had become an American tool. The Seabees' contribution extended far beyond the Pacific. Their methods rewrote the blueprint of military operations. No longer could armies think of engineers as a rear echelon function. The Seabees had proven that construction was combat, that bulldozers and steel were as vital as rifles and shells. Every war that followed, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan, echoed with their doctrine. Forward operating bases, rapid runway repair, combat engineers building under fire, all of it traced back to the islands where men in dungarees carved airfields from mud. The Cold War sharpened this lesson. As NATO prepared to face the Warsaw Pact, the idea of mobility and speed became central. The Soviets built massive armored divisions. The West invested in logistics, engineering, and rapid deployment. The Seabees' legacy lived in every pre-positioned supply depot, every airstrip carved from frozen tundra, every pontoon bridge thrown across rivers under fire. The art of war had absorbed their lesson. Connection and speed outweigh raw firepower. Even in the modern age, their spirit lingers. In the Gulf War of 1991, coalition forces constructed forward airfields in the desert almost overnight, launching sorties that paralyzed Iraq's defenses. In Afghanistan, engineers built bases in hostile valleys under the shadow of mountains, echoing the Seabees' work under Japanese fire. In Iraq, runways cratered by missiles were repaired in hours, not weeks, ensuring that air power never faltered. Every time a soldier saw a base rise from nothing, every time a pilot took off from a runway carved in hostile ground, they were witnessing the Seabees' legacy. The human cost should not be forgotten. The Seabees bled for their work. Many died at Bougainville, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, their bulldozers and graders targeted by enemy fire. Their sweat and lives poured into the runways that others would use. They carried rifles not just as decoration, but as necessity, fighting off raids and snipers even as they worked. They embodied a paradox. Men who built under the very shadow of death, who turned destruction into creation while shells fell around them. Their graves dot the islands they transformed, silent markers of sacrifice often overlooked in the shadow of infantry and pilots, and yet their influence is remembered. Veterans of the Pacific never forgot the sight of Seabees driving machines through surf, of engines roaring against the jungle, of runways appearing where none should exist. Marines, sailors, and soldiers alike spoke of them with reverence, calling them miracle workers, saviors, the men who gave them the skies. Japanese survivors too remembered them, not with reverence but with disbelief. For them, the Seabees were a symbol of inevitability, proof that the Americans possessed not just weapons, but an inexhaustible will to build. History's judgment is clear. Without the Seabees, the island-hopping campaign would have stalled, strangled by distance and terrain. With them it surged forward, each airfield a springboard, each base a hammer blow against Japan's outer ring. They made possible the long march from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, and ultimately, the bomber raids that darkened Japan's skies. It was from airfields they built on Tinian that the final, terrible missions of the war began, missions that ended with mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with the Emperor's surrender. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, facing trial at Nuremberg, once admitted, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same could be said of the Pacific. Japan built strong garrisons, but America built bases that worked together, linked by airstrips and harbors conjured by the Seabees. Strength mattered, but speed mattered more. The legacy is not just military, it is human. The Seabees demonstrated that even in the darkest crucible of war, men could create. Where the Japanese saw destruction, the Seabees saw opportunity to build. Where jungles seemed impassable, they saw raw material. They embodied resilience, turning chaos into order, despair into hope. In a war defined by death, they were proof of life's power to shape destiny. As the decades pass, the lesson remains as sharp as ever. Modern warfare is no longer about static fronts and fortified bunkers. It is about networks, about speed, about the ability to project power instantly across the globe. The Seabees, with their bulldozers and steel matting, foreshadowed the age of network-centric warfare. They taught that the side which connects faster, which builds faster, which adapts faster, wins. And so, when one looks back on the Pacific campaign, it is not enough to remember only the battles and the blood. One must remember the sound of engines at night, the sight of bulldozers pushing through surf, the gleam of steel runways under the tropical sun. One must remember the disbelief of Japanese soldiers staring at airfields that should not exist. Because in the end, the story of the Seabees is the story of the war itself, a story of speed over delay, ingenuity over tradition, creation over destruction. They were builders who fought, fighters who built, and in their paradox lay the secret to victory. In modern war, as in the jungles of the Pacific, firepower matters. But connection outweighs firepower. Speed defeats armor, and those who can build win.